Now we proceed our discussion on chapter 3 of the book, which talks about the global interstate system and also global governance and justice institutions, which means that we'll be talking about the structure and the framework of the United Nations as an international organization. But before that, let's have the learner's objectives first. Number one is to learn about the concept of global interstate system, its dynamics, relevance, and use. Second is to equip knowledge on the importance and objectives of world governance. Third, understand the commitments of the member states in the international community. And number four, realize the significance of the UN on the political issues involving the government of the member states. So I'll be showing you pictures or set of pictures about UN. Okay, and what can you observe about these logos, about this set of pictures, right? As we can see, these are organizations. These are established for a specific purpose. Okay, so as you can see also, they have distinct and different purpose. One is for the concern of economy. One is for the concern of peace, and one is there for the settlement of any disputes, arbitration, maritime conflict. They are there to settle the differences and commonalities of these parties, right? So, but before that, let's look at the historical antecedents of the United Nations. I am sure you are all familiar with the UN. Maybe since you were in your basic education, right? Your teachers from basic ed made mention, I'm sure, about the concept of the United Nations. But now we will look at its historical background at the same time. What is the picture of the United Nations in the present time? The UN emerged out of the travail of the World War II as a symbol of man's undismayed determination to establish for all nations a rule of law that would forever banish the terrible arbitrament of war and solution of international disputes. The UN was envisioned as the answer to the universal yearning for peace and friendship among all peoples, regardless of color or creed. So, from that statements already, we can conclude that the UN is created for the purpose of preventing another warfare. As we all know, in our world history, we have suffered and we have experienced already the different warfares which caused our economic turmoil, which caused the severance of friendship, which caused too much casualties, death, the death of the millions of people, the death of the business industries, the death of our economy, in short, right? So this organization is created to bring peace, not only in the regional sphere, not only in the national sphere, but in the global sphere in general, right? The League of Nations was it was only World War One that the first concrete step in this direction was taken with the organization of the League of Nations, but certain inherent weakness of the body, coupled with the fact that US was not a member thereof, which was shattered in 1939 and formally dissolved in 1946. In this discussion, this is the first major contradiction or the irony of the United States government, because the League of Nations was created basically to prevent another warfare. Okay, the League of Nations was established after the First World War. I'm sure we all know that the First World War originated in Europe, right? And ironically, the United Nations was not a member thereof. And so that's why, since the League of Nations were established by few nations, by few countries already, okay? And what was the result? It resulted to failure because in 1939 to 1945, there was the Second World War. And so the League of Nations hasn't been successful in its aim of preventing the Second World War. On June 12, 1941, the London Declaration by several members of British Commonwealth and a number of governments exiled to work together with other peoples in war and in peace toward economic and social progress. Also on August 14, 1941, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which expressed their hope for a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in all lands may lead out their lives in freedom from fear and want. In 1942, declaration by the United Nations signed by 26 countries and the signatories all pledged to employ their full resources against the Axis powers and not to make a separate armistice or peace with the enemies. And in 1943, the first formal step to creation of UN was the Moscow Declaration signed by China, Soviet Union, UK, and US, where they recognized the necessity of establishing at the earliest practicable date a general international organization based on the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and open to membership by all such states, large or small, for maintenance of international peace and security. So simply, okay, in order for us to understand what is UN all about, prior to the First World War, there was no international organization as big as UN or as big as perhaps the League of Nations. So what's the tendency if there are warfare? That's why we have to know also the concept of anarchy in studying the United Nations. In anarchical system, there is no law. There's lawlessness. There's absence of rules. There's absence of protocols, absence of different conventions. Meaning there is no prior agreement, there is no prior contract, there is no prior mechanism on resolving disputes, resolving um, warfare or conflict between parties or between neighboring states or nations. So in the absence of this world government, in the absence of this organization that would cater all these needs and to settle the differences of these states, because these states have different perspective, they have different culture, they have different belief, they have different dynamics of thinking, right? So in the absence of that, what is the tendency? 100% tendency. There will be warfare. In fact, even if we have rules, even if we have laws, there's uh there's still a possibility of engaging into war, such as what happened in United in Russian Federation and uh, Ukrainian government, right? So it's better to have rules, okay, rather than believing or setting our actions based on the power and the hegemonic approach of the international superpowers. Because in the first place, at the outset, these states or these countries do not have the same status, do not have the same military status, economic capabilities, and perhaps political stabilities in their own respective nation or state, right? So in the Dumbarton Oaks proposals where the blueprint of UN was initially drafted in a conference in Washington, it was here that the Security Council was conceived as the key body of the UN. San Francisco Conference, on the basis of previous agreements from April 25 to June 26, 1945, 50 nations met and prepared and unanimously approved the Charter of the UN, which came into force in October 1945 with the filing of instruments of ratification by the members of the Big Five and the majority of other signatories. We will know about the Big Five later on. From that onset resulted the United Nations, which is a body possessed of not only juridical but also of international personality and vested with prerogatives normally pertaining only to sovereign states. Okay, the UN Charter. Okay, UN Charter is treated as both as a treaty and a constitution. Okay, if we look at the constitution in the perspective of the Filipinos, no, we would define this as a fundamental law of the land. It's the most powerful laws among all laws in the Philippines. No, it's the most powerful and it's the supreme and superior law in the Philippines. Okay, it's a long document with 111 articles besides the preamble and concluding provisions, and includes the statute of the ICJ, which is an annex of the United Nations. Because later on, we will know about the different organs of the UN. It may be considered as treaty because it derives its binding force from the agreement of the parties to it. In another sense, it may be regarded as a constitution insofar as it provides for the organization and operations of the different organs of the UN and for the adoption of any change in its provisions through a formal process of amendment. So there is also a transitory provision in that in the UN Charter. So Article 103 of the Charter provides that in case of conflict between the obligations of the members of the UN under the present Charter and their obligations under any other international agreement, their obligations under the present Charter shall prevail. So although that there are, or the states or the member states of the UN are free to arrange their own mechanism in resolving any dispute or any conflict. However, if there is a conflict between the international agreement or the bilateral agreement or multilateral agreement signed by by these parties who are member states to the UN, and the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations, then the UN Charter shall prevail. Because again, no, it is also known as the Constitution. Parang it's Constitution of um, the international government, right? So kung papasok ka ng agreement sa China or sa US and then it violated the provisions of the charter, then that would mean that your international agreement signed by the Philippines and China or signed by Philippines and US would be invalid because it's not congruent and violative of the Charter of the United Nations. So, question. Under the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, where injured states receive war reparations but waive all claims against Japan, is this valid? Okay, according to our Supreme Court, it's not valid. The treaty must yield to the UN Charter, which provides for respect of human rights. Under Article 103 of the UN Charter, it states that the obligations of UN members prevail over any international agreement. Still, the waiver is qualified and operative only while Japan had inadequate resources to make full reparation. Okay, so that's an example that how superior is the UN Charter. So how can you amend the Charter of the UN when they are adopted by a vote of two-thirds of the members of the GA and ratified in accordance with the respective constitutional process by two-thirds of the members of the United Nations, including the permanent members of the Security Council? So review of the Charter. General Conference may be called by majority vote of the GA and any 9 members of the Security Council for the purpose of reviewing the Charter. And amendments, of course, proposed shall take effect when ratified by two-thirds of all the members of the UN, including permanent members of the Security Council. Again, so it's two-thirds, no? It's not simple majority, because when we say simple majority, it's half plus one, no? 50% plus one. All right. The purpose constitute the rights and data of the UN are the aggregation to common ends, the cause and object of the charter to which the member states collectively and severally subscribe. So under Article 1 of the UN Charter, the organization is aimed to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Again, the parties in the United Nations are not individuals, but of course, member states, no? States. to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. Also, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems and economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So, as we can see, the vision or the mission of the United Nations is all encompassing. It will have a program, or it has a program on the economic aspect, the social aspect, uh, the cultural aspect, and even humanitarian character. That's why we can maybe we can observe that during the typhoon, the many typhoons that we have experienced here in the Philippines, we have been receiving humanitarian aids and assistance coming from the international organization, and that's one of the manifestations of these statements, right? To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. So the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its member states, which means we follow the famous international law maxim that parem parem non habet imperium, which means that no matter how powerful you are in the international arena or in the international or community, let's say China versus Philippines, right? Um, Definitely, China is more powerful. China is more rich. China is more economically stable. But under the principle of sovereign equality, or under the doctrine of the parent param non habet imperium, okay, the hegemon or a powerful state, powerful country do not have the power to impose its will against another sovereign, because these are two sovereign states. They are both sovereign nations. Therefore, they are equal in the eyes of the international law. Okay, although in reality, that would really matter, that would not be the same case. But um, insofar as this principle is concerned, we are supposed to be equal with them. We should be treated equal, and we should be following the law or the international law equally, regardless of your economic capacity, regardless of your military capacity, etc., etc. All members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. So your actions should be in consonance to the charter, the provisions of the UN Charter. All members shall settle their international dispute by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. So gone are the days when there is conflict and we immediately declare war. Gone are the days when, in case of misunderstanding or differences between two parties, uh, we immediately engage in killing people, in having life casualties. So all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. All members shall give the UN every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present charter, and shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United States nation is taking preventive or enforcement action. The organization shall ensure that states which are not members of the UN act in accordance with these principles so far as may be necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. Again, let's take note also, no, of this organization, that once you have signed in the charter, once you become a member of the UN, the principle of auto limitation will take place, which means that you are surrendering a portion of your sovereignty to that organization, which means that whatever the charter is saying, whatever the organization would like you to do, then you must follow and you must adhere to it, because that's the rule and that's the principle um, delineated in that organization, right? So that's when our good faith and our adherence to our membership in not only in the UN but in the different type of organizations that we are in, we have to follow what is the charter is saying. Okay, what are the principles of the organization, and how do we do that? No, how can we manifest that? By making our laws consistent with the principles of the organization. Of course, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter. But these principles shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measure under Chapter 7. So what are the exceptions of the domestic jurisdiction clause? No, when the internal conflict aggravates into a threat or an actual breach of international peace and security. Again, when we say domestic jurisdiction, the foreign countries or foreign authorities do not have the right to intervene. Okay, because whatever is the conflict within your jurisdiction, in the case of the Philippines, for example, nagkagera diri, no, if may gera dito sa Pilipinas, no, uh, the international authorities do not have the authority yet to intervene with the state affairs because it's considered as an internal affairs within the Philippine jurisdiction. Okay, so if the war happened in Sulu, then so be it. Okay, it's the problem of the Philippine government and not by foreign authorities. So that's domestic jurisdiction clause. So what are the exceptions? When can international organizations such as UN can intervene? When the internal conflict aggravates into a threat or actual breach of international peace and security. Okay, so kung if there is already an actual threat to the peace and security of the neighboring states. Let's say, for example, the warfare which originated in Sulu um, extended in the perhaps jurisdiction of Indonesia or jurisdiction of Malaysia, then that's the time that domestic jurisdiction clause will not apply anymore. Second, where parties voluntarily invoke and submit to the jurisdiction of the UN for settlement of their dispute. Okay, like the case of the Philippines, if we bring our case against the China, okay, Chinese government over the West Philippine Sea before the ICJ or the International um, Court of Justice, then we can definitely do that. We are submitting voluntarily to the jurisdiction of the UN. All right. So illustration in 1960 in Republic versus Congo, Republic of Congo, which started a civil war, became in fact an international war between the socialist states and the Western democracies. That's an example. Okay, the internal affair or the internal warfare extended to the other countries and it became an international war. So that's why the domestic jurisdiction clause will not apply anymore. So there are two kinds of membership in the United Nations. Okay, first, original or charter members. They are those states which participated in the United Nations Conference on the International Organization at San Francisco or have previously signed the declaration. Philippines was included as an original member, although the country was not yet a state at that time, because at that time, uh, yeah, we were under the occupation of Japanese government. And there were 51 original members. So elected members, the other members may be admitted to the UN by the decision of the GA. So when you apply, when you want to become a member, no, of course you have to go to the General Assembly and you have to um, obtain the decision of the GA. Upon the favorable recommendation of the Security Council and possess the qualification for admission. And one basic qualification is that you should be considered as a state. Okay, when we talk about state, you must have people, territory, government. Excuse me. Recognition is essential insofar as international is concerned, and of course your sovereignty. No, hindi naman pwede you consider yourself as a state when you do not have sovereignty yet. Perhaps you will be under you're under Chinese government or you're under US government supervision, okay, or power and authority by these states, then you have no sovereignty, then you're not considered as a state yet, and therefore you cannot be a member of UN. Note, the General Assembly cannot admit an applicant for membership without favorable recommendation of the Security Council. And by the way, Security Council is the most powerful, the most potent organ of the United Nations. Okay, we will deal with them later on. What are qualifications? You must be a state, must be peace-loving state, must accept the obligations of the charter, and it must be able to carry out these obligations, and it must be willing to carry out. Yeah, sorry. Uh, you must be willing to carry out the obligations, which is the United Nations Charter. So can you suspend members, okay, in the UN? A member of the UN against which preventive or enforcement action has been taken by the Security Council may be suspended from the exercises of its rights and privileges by upon favorable recommendation of at least 9 members of the Security Council, because the Security Council has permanent members and the non-permanent members. Katong mga non-permanent members, they are elected or they are chosen by the GA, affected by 2/3 of those present voting in the General Assembly. Again, no, another manifestation of its power. Only the SC can lift the suspension, also by the qualified majority vote. So if there is a suspension and the Security Council has yet to lift that suspension and the GA has voted on it, the GA has no power to do it. Okay, it must be with the authority and power of the Security Council. What are the effects of suspension then? No, the state is prevented from participating in GA meetings, and the state from elected to or continuing to serve in the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, or Trusteeship Council. No? So this is the possible effects of suspension. Nationals of the suspended member may continue serving in the Secretariat and ICJ as they are considered international officials. No? So let's say you're a Filipino, you're working as a staff in the ICJ, for instance, then it will not affect the suspension of your country, your government would not affect because you are considered as international officials. Can you expel members in the UN? No. A member which was persistently violated the principles may be expelled. First, upon the favorable recommendation of the Security Council, again by a qualified majority and by 2/3 of those present and voting in the GA. Okay. This is a penalty against member which did not satisfy the basic requirements of membership and would be like cancerous growth, thus better removed. So that's one of the consequences if you get expelled by the definitely no Security Council. Sila man talaga mag-decide. So withdrawal of members, no provision on withdrawal from membership was included in the charter for fear that it might encourage excessive withdrawal. So wala tayong withdrawal provision sa UN. But in a special committee report in the San Francisco Conference, when not categorically allowing such, expressed view that member might withdraw. So in the absence of that withdrawal provision, you may, okay, you might still withdraw from UN if organization was revealed to be unable to maintain peace or could do so only at the expense of law and justice. Members' rights and obligations were changed by a charter amendment in which it had not concurred or which it finds itself unable to accept. And definitely under international law, my opinion is that it's fully guaranteed because the right to participate in an organization includes right not to participate thereof. Okay. Amendment duly accepted by the necessary majority either in the GA or in a general conference is not ratified. So these are the organs, different organs of the United Nations. We have the General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, which is hasn't been active for many years, International Court of Justice, and Secretariat. So the General Assembly, it's the most representative organ and consists of all of the members of the organization, each of which is entitled to send not more than 5 representatives with 5 alternates as well as technical staff. It meets in regular annual session from third Tuesday of September or in special session at the call of majority of its members or at the request of the Security Council. So what are the voting rules in General Assembly? Each member has one vote, right? Decisions on important issues such as election, admission, suspension, 1:1. Expulsion, trusteeship, budget are taken by 2/3 of those present and voting. All other matters, including the question of whether a question is important or not, are decided by the majority of those present. What are the functions of General Assembly? It is deliberative, supervisory, financial, elective, and constituent functions. Deliberative, you initiate studies, recommend, discuss, no? Codification of the international laws, recommending measures for peaceful adjustment of any situation. Of course, are, if you happen to be a representative of the Philippines in the General Assembly, you must be, of course, an expert of international law. Okay, not only an expert of international law, but you must be expert also of our constitution in the Philippines, because you are representing the Philippines, and therefore you should also consider the metes and bounds of the law there and what might violate the constitution, because again, in case of conflict with our obligation before the UN and our obligation before the Constitution, the 1987 Philippine Constitution, of course, our Constitution will at all times prevail over our international obligations. Supervisory, receiving and considering annual and special reports from the other organs of the UN, recommend approving trusteeship agreements in non-strategic areas, financial consideration and approval of the budget of the UN. So you'll be there for voting, no? Expenses and approved financial arrangements with specialized agencies. Elective, election of permanent members of the SC, all the members of the Economic and Social Council, and some of the members of the Trusteeship Council, and in concurrence with the Security Council, the Secretary General, and the judges of the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. And constituent functions such as the admission of members and amendment of the Charter of the United Nations. Again, with the favorable recommendation of the Security Council. So this is an example. UN votes to demand Russia's attacks on Ukraine and troops to withdraw. So what was the voting result? Okay, in favor, 141, against 5, abstention 35. And Chinese government, I think, abstain on this voting, no, which is ironic because Russia and China, as we all know, have been a good allies. Now we proceed with Security Council, the most potent organ with the power to make legally binding resolutions. No other organ or any annex of the United Nations can legally bind or can issue binding resolutions other than the Security Council. It's the most powerful organ in the UN. It is comprised of the strongest military states and is a concrete manifestation of the reality of power dynamics. Okay, even if we say that we are living under the principle of sovereign equality, but again, this would manifest how these powerful states, how the strongest states in the United Nations would enforce their power, would exercise their power. This is the key organ in the maintenance of international peace and security, and the Security Council is the organ of the UN responsible for international peace and security. It is the only body in the UN with the authority to take action in defense of the collective security needs of the international community. So as if they're like saviors in the international community, that they are the only key to the peace and security of the nations, no, in the international community. In 1999, the Council issued the first in a series resolution to impound the assets of individuals supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. This has been expanded several times since then and has led to a new norm that UN economic sanctions should primarily take the form of smart sanctions that attack individuals responsible for threats to international peace and security rather than a state and all its citizens as a whole. But again, no, this is very dangerous, and especially when you are sanctioning powerful states also. That's why uh, although they have been sanctioning Russia then and now for its actions against the Ukrainian government, but they could not fully enforce it. Yeah, because Russia is one of the strongest states in the organization, and you don't want to commit mistakes there. Otherwise, uh, it will cause a lot of casualties, not only in the European part, but again to the extent of again perhaps making casualties in the international community in general. The Charter's adoption ushered in a new international legal system through which members of the UN are legally subordinate to the Security Council to a striking degree. This, of course, does not translate automatically to state compliance with these obligations, and this section investigates the ways that states and the UN approach the question of compliance. The Council aims to produce compliance by states by a combination of political suasion and the threat of military enforcement. So, what's the difference between peacekeeping versus peace enforcement of the UN? When we talk about peace enforcement, are coercive invasions of countries by a UN authorized force intent on eliminating or mitigating a threat to international peace and security. Usually, they employ the military personnel of those neutral states. Excuse me. So, how about peacekeeping missions? By contrast, are negotiated between the UN and states or other parties and have the consent of the government in the state where they are operating. They often occur in the shadow of a threat from the council, but in legal form, they are always present with the formal consent of the country. So, if, for instance, there are uh, ongoing war and the United Nations can employ its peacekeeping missions and peace enforcement missions. The military operation against al-Qaddafi in Libya in 2011 represents the peace enforcement model, while the Rwanda mission from 1993-94 is an example of peacekeeping mission, at least at the start. Both operations were intended as responses to threats to international peace and security, and they included demands by the Council that the states involved comply with certain conditions set out in the Council's resolutions, but logic by which they induced compliance was dramatically different between the two. And why can't the UN do the same thing in Russia and Ukraine war? No? And of course, you already know the answer. Composition of the Security Council. Who are the 5 permanent members? They're known as the Big Five. We have China, France, the UK, or the Great Britain, and Russian government, as well as the United States. They are given preferred position because of the feeling that they were the states that, in view of their prestige and power, will be called upon to provide the leadership and physical force that might be needed to preserve the peace of the world. There are 10 non-permanent members. They are elected for 2-year terms by the GA. We have 5 from African and Asian states, 2 from Latin American states, 2 from Western European states, 1 from Eastern European states. Okay. They are not eligible for immediate re-election. They are based on the geographical distribution as a recognition of the relative importance of the areas affected in the maintenance of international orders. What are the voting rules in the Security Council? This is governed by the Yalta formula as devised in the Crimea Conference, where each member has 1 vote, but the distinction between the Big Five and the non-permanent members is present in case of substantive issues. Procedural matters involve questions as to the organization and meetings of this SC, establishment of subsidiary organs, and participation of state parties to a dispute in the discussion of organ. And non-procedural matters are those that may require this SC under its responsibility of maintaining or restoring world peace to invoke the measure of enforcement. Okay, again, these are all based on the Charter of the UN. How about the veto power, okay, which is often exercised by these permanent members? A permanent member is enabled to case veto and prevent agreement on a non-procedural question, even if it's supported by all the other members of the Security Council. This is also one of the problems of the Philippines that they might, face when they bring up the case against China in the West Philippine Sea. Uh, because China is one of the members of the Big Five, one of the members of the Security Council. Then, assuming that the four other countries voted in favor of the Philippines and China is there, right? And it again, this council or this organ cannot decide should one state or one member exercises its veto power, and that's one of the authority vested or given to Chinese government. It may also exercise a double veto by means of which it can disapprove any proposal to consider a question merely procedural and thereafter vote against the question itself on the merits. Abstention or absence is not considered a veto. So what's the purpose of the YELTA formula? This is to ensure that unity of permanent members and measures to be taken the pursuit of its primary function and maintain international peace and security. We also have the ECOSOC. It has 54 members elected by GA for 3-year terms. They meet regular session and can have special session at the request of a majority of its members. Each member has one vote, and decisions are reached by majority of present and voting. What's the primary objective of ECOSOC? It is to advance the economic, social, and environmental dimension of sustainable development. In fact, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are even required to report to the United Nations about the borrowings and all the transactions made by the member states there. It serves as gateway of the UN's partnership with the rest of the world for the coordination, policy review, dialogue, recommendation, and implementation of international development goals. All right. So these are the uh, aims of the ECOSOC as an organ of the UN. First, higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development, solutions of international economic, social, health, and related problems, and international cultural and educational cooperation, universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. How about Trusteeship Council? It is charged with the duty of assisting the Security Council. Yeah, usually this, not usually, but the council really is there to help countries who are not yet independent, okay, who cannot establish its own government, who is not yet ready for self-governance. That's why this council is created to help those countries to be self-government, to be self-governing states. That's basically their purpose. And right now, I think it has been non-active organ of the United Nations because mostly naman ng mga states ngayon are self-governing na, no? Or they possess the qualities or the capabilities to have their own government. This has largely become obsolete with the conversion of practically all trust territories into full-fledged miniature states. How about the International Court of Justice? It's the judicial organ of the UN which function in accordance with the statute. All members of UN are ipso facto parties to the statute. Okay, it is composed of 15 members elected by absolute majority of in GA and the Security Council. Judges must be of high moral character, possess qualifications required in the respective countries for the appointment to their highest judicial offices, or are jury consults of recognized competence in international law. No two of them may be nationals of the same state, and in such event, two or more obtain majority, the elders shall be considered as elected. Of course, you cannot decide, no? If, for example, you have a judge there elected as a judge, a Filipino judge before the International Court of Justice, and that judge will be one of those who will be deciding the case against Chinese government. And it cannot be done. Okay, so your case should be tried and should be how do I say this? The judges, okay, should adjudicate the case would be those from other countries or have no interest over the case held by the council or the court. So it shall elect president and vice president serving for 3 years. So they have president and vice president. It shall remain permanently in session at The Hague or elsewhere except during judicial vacation. They may meet en banc or in chambers composed of 3 or more judges. So when we say en banc, the all 15 members should decide. When we talk about dalawa yan, it's en banc or division. When we say division, it's either by 3. Okay, yung 3 judges, kayo lang mag-decide. Yung 5 judges, may case sila. Yung other 5, may ibang din silang case. No? So when we say en banc, no, all the members will adjudicate the case and will decide over the case. All questions are decided by a majority. Quorum is 9 when the full court is sitting. 3 elements are necessary for an international dispute to come with the jurisdiction of the ICJ. A legal dispute which is between states. No? So dapat between states. Consent to the jurisdiction of the court to the case. All 3 conditions must be satisfied for the court to be allowed to hear the case. What are the functions of the court? Decide contentious cases. Only states, including non-members of UN, may be parties in the contentious cases. What if the one member to a party in the dispute is a non-member of the United Nations? Can it still have jurisdiction over the case? The answer is yes, no, and of course, if there's consent coming from that party. Render advisory opinions. Advisory opinions may be given upon request of GA or the Security Council, as well as other organs of the UN. Problem is that advisory opinions are mere opinions and not binding. Okay, that's the problem. So if it is not enforced by the Security Council, then it will just be considered as a mere piece of paper. Okay, the jurisdiction of the ICJ is based on the consent of the parties as manifest under the optional jurisdiction clause in Article 36 of the ICJ statute and comprises all cases which they refer to it and all the matters provided in the charter. So no consent, no acquisition of jurisdiction. That's basic in international law. It's all consensual. Kung hindi ka magpayag na mag-submit ka sa jurisdiction ng court, then that's it. Okay, that's your right under international law. Okay. So this is the structure of the ICJ. Okay. So what are the cases under the ICJ? We have interpretation of a treaty, any question of international law, existence of any fact which if established could constitute a breach of an international obligation, and the nature or extent of the case, of course. Can ICJ give advisory opinions? Yes, on any legal question at the request of the GA or Security Council or other organs of the UN when authorized by the GA. So, where's the seat of the ICJ? The Peace Palace at The Hague, Netherlands. How many members are there? We have 15 members of the ICJ and 9 years and can be re-elected. Okay, again, sometimes or more often than not, the people would use interchangeably ICJ versus ICC. But definitely they are different because ICC is an independent institution. Okay, it's different as to the year on which it is established. No, the ICJ was established in 1946, while ICC was in 2002. And you look at the subject matter, it's definitely different. Okay, ICC prosecutes individuals. ICJ caters cases between states, such as sovereignty, boundary, and maritime dispute, trade, natural resources, human rights treaty violation, etc. For ICC, they cater cases genocide, crime against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. How about the funding? ICC is not UN funded, okay, but ICJ is obtained its funds from the UN. The Secretariat is the another organ of the UN, is the highest representative of UN and is authorized to act in its behalf. When acting in such capacity, he is entitled to full diplomatic immunities and privileges. So basically, the purpose of the Secretariat is to work on the day-to-day transactions in the United Nations, right? Prepares the budget and provides for technical facilities to the different organs of the UN and coordinates the vast administrative machinery of the UN. Okay, so I'll end my discussion there. Thanks for listening.